I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wattamatagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Justine Lloyd from the Department of Sociology and the Centre for Media History, who's going to get this hopefully not too hapless seminar presentation underway. Thanks, Justine.
Thank you, Bridget. I'd also like to thank Bridget for her acknowledgement and to acknowledge that I'm joining the Zoom today from Cadigal and Bidjigal land. And just to acknowledge, always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and that sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia. So I'm very excited to be here and to be the discussant for the book. We're kind of learning all these new rituals of Zoom book launches and ways of doing things remotely. In fact, I'm so excited I actually accidentally joined yesterday at the same time because I was so in so much anticipation to do this book launch. And to see everybody, it's so wonderful to have so many people here today that have been colleagues and had discussions with over a while, and lovely to see you here. So it's my pleasure to be the discussant and to introduce Bridget. We're going to run it, I think, for about 45 minutes of discussion with Bridget, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, I think I'm not very good at multitasking, so maybe someone else, if you want to have a look in the chat, add questions in the chat, maybe Ty could facilitate those at the end, that would be great. So to introduce Bridget, many of you I'm sure know Bridget, and that's why you're here today. Bridget is a professor of media in the Department of Media, Communication, Creative Arts, Language and Literature, which is also known as MCCALL at Macquarie University. So Bridget edited the field-defining collection, which is called A Companion to Australian Media in 2014, but I know it came out in 2014, but there were many years before that of planning it. And I remember being at a conference once where Bridget suggested she was going to do this in this incredible scope. And you all know Bridget's skills in bringing people together. That Companion is really a testament to that. She's also the author of 5 books about the history of Australian media, and the most recent of which is, if we can even have make a picture of it, because I don't have a physical copy to hold up, which is titled Australian Radio Listeners and Television Viewers, Historical Perspectives. So I've got a few questions for Bridget about the book and about some of the themes in it. I hope some of you get a chance to read it, but I'm really interested in a lot of the conceptualization of the project and how Bridget thought about this, because it's such a huge topic and goes across many media and different broadcasting types and so on. So really I'm interested, the first question is, how did you come to write the book?
Thanks so much, Justine. And I feel like I should preface this afternoon with yet another apology, which indeed Justine doesn't have a copy of the book. I found myself at my weekender in Bundanoon in the Southern Highlands a few days before the lockdown in Sydney was announced. And then decided to stay on. So I need to confess, I somehow managed to have a holiday house without a copy of my most recent book. So I myself have not had a hard copy to look at to refresh my memory in recent days. And I also haven't been able to share a hard copy with Justine. So we've both been relying on the e-book. So poor Justine didn't even get a freebie in advance of today. Look, this book actually began with a Macquarie University initiative in 2009. 2 other then Macquarie colleagues, Marnie Hughes-Warrington, Michelle Arrow in Modern History, and I decided through the Centre for Media History to host a colloquium on the history of Australian media audiences. We were looking at readers of newspapers and magazines. We were looking at film viewers. We were also looking at radio and television. We held a colloquium and then published a special issue of Media International Australia in 2009 based on that colloquium. And you'll see I've just managed to put up there, because again, I don't have a copy of this at hand, but I've cut and pasted in the titles of those papers to give you a sort of sense of the work that was being undertaken sort of 12 years ago now by some Australian scholars in this field. I've myself have been working on the history of the media, largely the Australian media, since the 1990s. So much of the history that I've done and most other Australian scholars have done, centering on the media, has been focused on the production and the content side of things. But as we've seen a turn in international scholarship, I would say, in the last 20 years or so, towards looking at the history of media reception, I decided to dip my toe in the water and to embark on a project that was looking essentially at a century of the consumption of and the engagement with Australian radio and television broadcasters, stations, networks and programs. And I thought I wouldn't touch print. I should acknowledge another Macquarie colleague, Professor Lucy Taxer, who co-authored an excellent book on called Australian Readers Remember in the 1990s, which was one of the really sort of first and pioneering studies of the history of audience reception in Australia. I thought, for my study, having just come off writing a book about the history of commercial radio in Australia, I thought that I would try to narrow my focus just to radio and television. And as I think you've indicated, Justine, that's quite a big topic and scope and canvas in its own right.
Sorry, I have to keep remembering to mute. I didn't want you to get any background noise from my noisy road outside. The question is, it's so fascinating how you've broken up that big topic into some smaller themes and ways of thinking about audiences. And for people who've had a chance to look at the book, there are these very interesting case studies, or you call them perspectives, on audiences. So I was just wondering about why those perspectives, and maybe you could highlight a couple of them, because I think they're so interesting in ways of thinking about media audience, the process of becoming an audience to media.
As I started working on this in the first year or two, I came to realise, even more so than when I'd been writing the ARC application, how big the topic is, but how many different ways there are to approach it, both in terms of sources, but also in terms of subject matter. And maybe I should just make a really basic point at this stage, which is that writing about or exploring the history of media audiences has its challenges, just in a really pragmatic sense. Media content itself is ephemeral. Audiences themselves leave even less traces. So one of my challenges as a historian, those of you who know me know that I love throwing myself into archives. So I needed, both when I was writing the application, but then when I was starting to work on the project, to convince myself that there were sources that I could use for this project. So the sorts of things I came to look for, there were reasonably obvious ones, such as letters to the editor of radio and television periodicals, where listeners would reflect on what they were listening to, what they were viewing, give a kind of, in many instances, sort of have a debate about cultural standards and cultural values. So there's some really sort of interesting contestations about public versus private, ABC versus commercial, different types of presenter voices, all sorts of things are sort of contested in the pages of broadcasting periodicals. But the other things that I came to look at were collections of fan mail, which we might come back to because I did end up writing a chapter on fan mail, collections of complaints files. So I principally, for my chapter called Outrage and Complaint, focus that largely on the records of complaints that were sent into the Australian Broadcasting Control Board, so the precursor to ACMA, so as the regulator of commercial radio and television content. I also looked for things like fan cards. One of the other things that could be looked, I think, further at is the sorts of materials produced by media companies or personalities that has been collected and is now available on, online auction sites such as eBay. A fairly early collection that I found that at least a few of you know I was really excited by was a collection of diaries that were written by a teenage girl in Melbourne in the 1970s and 1980s. She was an absolutely passionate fan of television and fan of film. And there's one box, only one box, but it's a bulging box of her diaries over a 10-year period. So when she was in her teens and into her early 20s, and she would record nearly every day in her diary what she was watching, where she was watching, what she watched on her television set in her suburban bedroom in Melbourne, while the rest of the family was watching, TV in their living room. So her mother got this TV for her on hire purchase. So that was a really sort of wonderful discovery. So I wrote a separate journal article about that called Diary of a Television Viewer. So increasingly as I went along, I thought, is there a book in this? The records of viewers seem sort of so fragmentary in a way, and there were so many different subjects and that you could look at there, whether it be about radio or TV, whether it be about watching, consuming the content of the public service broadcasters, the ABC and then SBS. And so in the end, I thought that this might end up being a study that was actually a whole series of journal articles and book chapters, rather than one of my, fairly big tomes that I've sort of been writing for 20 odd years. But as I got into the last year of the fellowship, I still felt that, I think I finally felt that I wanted to attempt to bring some of this scholarship together over and above what I'd been publishing in the previous few years. So I started to think about a sort of an episodic study that would allow me, in a sense, to do different case studies on different aspects of Australian broadcasting consumption. I think there was also an element of residual guilt, because in my book on commercial radio, I hadn't actually included a chapter on radio for children. So I decided one of my early chapters, really my first substantial chapter, which is called Aunts, Uncles and Argonauts, would look at the world for children created by radio broadcasters, pretty much up until World War II. So I was looking at the 1920s and the 1930s for that. And then I sort of moved on, I mean, writing about the Argonauts, this famous sort of programming initiative and movement launched by ABC Radio in the 1930s. I sort of built on my interest in that to actually write a second another chapter, which I call Club Loyalty, which was about radio and television clubs. And I'll just move forward, if I can get the technology to work, okay, so here are the Argonauts, and a number of you, I don't know if there's any, I can't see with my view if there's anyone in attendance who actually was an Argonaut, a member of the Argonauts Club. I know that there are some people associated with Macquarie, such as Chris Cunneen and Alana Nobbs, who were Argonauts. But I was interested in not just the programming that was offered to Australian children, but also the way in which sort of notions of community were created. The Argonauts Club had this pledge, there was a membership badge, you had your own ship name, your ship number. And I'm just going to show this, hopefully that slide's come up, Justine, which is a list of radio listener clubs, which was published in a broadcasting yearbook in 1939. Now, this is a list of most, but not all, of the clubs that were associated with commercial radio stations in 1939. So this doesn't even cover the ABC. And the figures really were quite extraordinary for these clubs. A parliamentary inquiry heard in 1942 that there were 150,000 women at that point estimated to belong to a radio club, and 400,000 children. So I wasn't just interested in the sort of broadcasting programs, but I was interested in the sort of extracurricular activities that radio and television stations and, you know, film studios also did this to some extent, creating this kind of world for their consumers.
It's so interesting, that story about the clubs and how, and you know, people would have seen that image of the audience itself being reflected back to itself in a way, and the clubs are so interesting. And it really strikes me that when I studied radio production, like in the 90s, the model that you were told was to always speak to an individual person, individual listener. You didn't ever use the plural. You always talked about people in the singular. But then that always felt wrong, because actually, as so many broadcasters do, like, you know, Philip Adams talks about the gladdies and talks about people in the plural. And I was thinking about people in podcasts always talk about the audience as a collective rather than individual person. So there's something really interesting that maybe people aren't aware of about these clubs, is that we're not just fan mail. You actually make an argument in that chapter about them actually being social movements. And I just wanted you to explain some of the, when you say extracurricular, it wasn't just social activities, but some of the actual infrastructure that they built and some of the way that they actually provided care for each other.
Yeah, thanks. So, so many of these clubs had infrastructure, as you suggest, around them, not just airtime on the station, but they had club rooms, for instance. So 2WG in Wagga Wagga had its own room and own premises that women from Wagga Wagga, but also local districts, would come to when they were visiting Wagga Wagga for their shopping, perhaps. And other clubs were similar, such as 7LA in Launceston and 3SH in Shepparton. I have to say, for someone who's not good at geography, I found radio history really useful. It's really helped orient me to different places around Australia. The you know, the extracurricular activities included things like community singing. So radio stations would host concerts in, say, the local town hall, where people would be able to come along, see station personalities and join in with those songs. They would often be given, you know, booklets so that they could sing along with the content. Justine, I think you've noticed that the 2WG actually did set up a nursing home for residents of Wagga Wagga. The 2GB Happiness Club, which is this enormous club that the station you will now probably know best for, you know, Alan Jones and Ray Hadley, launched, well, a particular broadcast, their Eunice Stelzer, launched this club for women right at the start of the Depression. It ends up acquiring tens of thousands of members. Branches are formed elsewhere, including in Adelaide through 5DN. Women who were members and who travelled would be welcomed by other members during their travels when their ship came into port. And in the 1940s, this club did establish Eurobadala, which was a accommodation provider for the needy. So there's, it's, I think I was interested in just how much infrastructure, how much radio and television stations and endeavours were parts of their communities, and the sorts of legacies that have been left in communities, you know, through things such as nursing homes. So these clubs had, some of them were for children, some of them were for women, some of them were for pet enthusiasts, some of them were for particular fans of particular sports. Some of them were had a really charitable focus, and the 2GB Happiness Club that I mentioned did support a number of charities. And of course, so many of these clubs also played a role in fundraising endeavours during World War II.
Yes, just that history of those clubs, and I won't get you to explain it now, but people, maybe if they read the book, can find out what the Miserable Club was. The Miserable Club, which is the opposite of the Happiness Club. But they were,
that's right. I'll just mention, Justine, that was set up by Jack Davey in 1939. Well, it was a spoof club, basically, you know, but I think what he was doing then was kind of indicating, by sort of suggesting this thing, promoting it over the airways, having things like, you know, Back to Long Bay Jail Week, etc. It was a kind of recognition of one of Australia's best known personalities, of how ubiquitous these clubs had become. And, you know, within a decade of, you know, properly established a sort of dual broadcasting system in Australia that was established in 1932. By 1939, these clubs were so well known that they started to be sent up by some popular personalities led by Jack Davey.
And I guess the other thing is to point out the nursing home in Wagga, that was actually the first aged care, formal aged care facility, I think, in Wagga. So there were really, yeah, there's such a variety of different purposes and different kinds of things going on there. It's so fascinating. And that chapter alone, we could spend the whole time just talking about that chapter alone. There's so much interesting stuff and stories in there. But I wanted to move on to maybe one of the other chapters where you talk about the fan mail. And did you want to show us any more images from the club section, or?
Look, I probably won't from the club, thanks, Justine.
Yep.
I know because of the difficulties at the start, I know we've lost some time, so I might just put up a few images as perhaps we chat a little bit about fan mail, indicating sort of how early, like as early as 1928, the sort of phenomenon of fan mail was being acknowledged by Australian radio publications. There would be articles about the fan mail that personalities received. There would be sketches about the sort of broadcasting mailbags of particular presenters, such as this so-called Colonel Jack Prentice on 2UW. I guess, Justine, we've been, I think what you were getting at several minutes ago was the way in which these kind of mass corporations present themselves as being about sort of intimacy and community through the ways in which they address listeners. So there's absolutely no doubt that these endeavours, particularly the endeavours of commercial radio stations, were very much motivated by commercial or business concerns about finding ways to draw audiences into the world of the radio station, to sort of inculcate a sense of loyalty. That's not to say that the members of these sorts of clubs themselves didn't actually do fantastic good work in their communities, as we've talked about in the last couple of minutes. Fan mail really had sort of two different strands. One was unsolicited, and I think that's the kind of fan mail that we think of, and I'll show you some images of fan mail that was sent to individual broadcasters, people who were genuine fans of particular personalities or particular programs. But fan mail could also be solicited by radio stations. So it's not until the 1930s that formal audience research begins to be established in the radio industry. So up until the early 1930s, the station managements relied quite a bit on receiving correspondence from listeners to get a sense of what was popular, what was resonating, perhaps what wasn't resonating or what wasn't popular. And Mackay, in his book, which is called, McNair, on his book called Radio Advertising in Australia in 1937, which is about much more than advertising. It's an absolute brick. But he discusses the competitions that radio stations would run to get responses to particular things, to particular initiatives. And also you would find program managers actually taking, piles of this correspondence to prospective sponsors to sort of give an indication of the popularity of station endeavours, and to kind of indicate, to sell time slots or spots in programs that would promote these products and also result in advertising revenue for the station. So there are those sort of, I think, two somewhat different strands to fan mail. I really, in the chapter that I wrote on fan mail, concentrated on letters that were received. Well, look, obviously I had to focus in on a few broadcasters. One of the collections I found was of a South Australian host of the ABC's Kindergarten of the Air. This is a collection that's held in the State Library of South Australia. I looked at the some of the correspondence that was received by Gwen Meredith, who wrote the Blue Hills. Now, I should acknowledge our colleague in modern history, Michelle Arrow, has done quite a bit of research on this collection. So I largely narrowed my focus to looking at the correspondence that, which Michelle hadn't looked at so much, to look at the correspondence that was received when the program was drawn to a close in 1976. So I do explore in this chapter the ways in which Australian listeners and viewers responded to the end of long-running and quite iconic broadcasting programs. And I'm just going to flash up, because I am conscious of time, a quote, an extract from quite a long letter that was received by the character of Fred in Fred and Maggie Everybody, which was a popular serial that finished in 1953. And so what I was trying to do was give a sense of the sort of role that these programs had in the lives and the routines of Australian listeners and viewers. In the chapter, I do spend some time looking in particular at the correspondence that was received by Ruth Cracknell for her famous, or should I say legendary, role in Mother and Son on ABC television. I'll just flash up a couple. This is actually some correspondence that she received from some children. And, you know, I think there's this real sort of element of sort of interactivity and a kind of interplay between the broadcast industry and the viewers and listeners. So obviously I'm arguing that listeners and viewers played a very sort of, well, some of them played a very active role, or very actively didn't just consume content, but interacted with content. So in the case of this girl, Rachel Wilkinson here, she creates her own Logie Award for well, I was going to say Best Actress, for the most popular personality on Australian TV. In relation to Roy and HG, I pull out, I'll just flash up a bit more of that for you. So I am so grateful to Greg Pickhaver for preserving this fan mail and presenting it to the State Library of New South Wales in 3 different tranches as part of his collection there. It's really substantial. And so again, there's this kind of sense of interplay. Listeners would talk about, would ask the presenters to acknowledge their weddings on air. They would talk about how they listened to the program, whether you know, it might be at a workplace or it might be on a naval boat. Just as the diary of this young girl in Melbourne that I spoke about in the 1970s, her diary, because it goes into the early 1980s, kind of documents the rise of the VCR and being able to record programs like A Country Practice and then play those programs back. So there's this kind of early version of time shifting that this viewer is engaging with in sort of utilising new media technologies. And it's something that listeners to Roy and HG either did, or in a number of instances, there are a number of male listeners who would ask their fathers to record programs, whether it was Roy and HG on TV or whether it was on radio, and then send them cassettes of those programs. These were sort of expatriate Australians who were working overseas and were absolutely bereft without the regular Saturday broadcasts of Roy and HG, or missing the sort of famous state of origin calls that Roy and HG did. There would be suggestions for scripts. Some, let me just show you here. Okay, so here was a young man who volunteered some humorous scripts that he was hoping might be included in by or utilised in some form by Roy and HG in their program This Sporting Life. People would write odes to Roy and HG. So there's this sort of, poetry surrounding Roy and HG. They would make fan T-shirts about the pair. So there's this whole sort of world of both sort of humorous and kind of intellectual buy-in, but there's also a world of material culture that comes to be a part of Australian broadcasting, and that listeners and viewers participate in enthusiastically. Oh, and actually, sorry, Justine, I know that we are running out of time. One of the chapters was complaints. And I'm just going to show you there, for those of you who have either read about or are old enough to remember Graham Kennedy's famous FARC crow call on Channel 9 in 1975. This is one of the files that survives in the Australian Broadcasting Control Board of complaints and criticisms, as the file is called. And so I've tried to use files like this as something of an insight into some of the sort of social attitudes in Australia to indecency, to sex, to violence, to excessive advertising, to cigarette advertising, etc. But this is one of my favourite files because it does relate to quite a famous, if not infamous, broadcast. But there was a fire at the Broadcasting Control Board's premises, and you can see that this file only just survived. So I sort of felt as though I had a duty to actually do some work on it, given given how marginal, given that, it's still there. But I guess this also does say something about the kind of serendipity of what is obviously a regulator has a responsibility to preserve files of complaints, to respond to complaints, which is another whole story. But in terms of things like fan mail, it's obviously up to individual broadcasters to make some decisions about what they're going to keep, whether they're going to keep anything, and then whether they might be willing to share that with researchers or with collecting institutions at some point in the future.
We're so lucky that that file was still readable. It looks like it just made it through the file. It's like forensic evidence in itself.
Yeah.
But there's so many amazing deep dives that you can take through the book into these stories and moments that you kind of feel connected with, I suppose, as people have been posting in the chat about family connections with programs and their own memories and wanting to read through things. You talk very much in the fan mail chapter, you talk about this idea of intercepting the fan mail, and sort of almost feels like you're sitting there with Bridget, sort of reading over the shoulder to read these files and read people's stories. And there's so many ways in which this kind of one-to-one communication of the media sort of gets broken up and transformed, I think, by the way that people write back to the broadcasters, but also the way that Bridget's bringing this all together. So all these people writing these individual letters, but Bridget's looking for these patterns and stories that connect them. It's so interesting. So I know we're going to run out of time, and we did want to leave some time for questions. So we have about 10 or so minutes for questions. So if people have questions, we can hand over, and perhaps Ty could let me know if there've been any in the chat, because I haven't been keeping my eye on the chat the whole time. But, anyone?
Not so much questions in the chat.
Any questions? Anyone like to comment or ask a question of Bridget while we're here? Tom has his hand up. Yes.
Hi, Bridget. Thank you very much for the presentation. it's such amazing archival work you've been doing, but I really also appreciate, as someone who also looks at fans though in a very different way, engaging with fan production and fan archives. As an anthropologist, I'm a little bit curious to hear a little bit more about your ideas around this material culture that's emerging around the history of, the reception of television and radio in Australia. And just, what sorts of other things did you encounter? Poetry about Roy and HG sounds wild, I have to admit. But what sorts of things did you encounter, and how do they fit into the kind of historical narrative you've been weaving together through your work?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And look, the field of audience studies ranges across a number of scholarly disciplines, and there are there are so many different ways in which you could approach it. A book that I have that I really appreciated as I embarked on this project myself was the book by Sue Turnbull and Kate Darien-Smith, which is on remembering Australian television. So there's a real sort of connect, and it's an edited book. So again, there's sort of different sort of, well, obviously there's different authors and different sort of case studies or cases that are examined in this book. But Frances Bonner does have a chapter in there where she talks about some of the sort of types of material culture that have been generated by Australian broadcasters. Frances has a particular interest in television. I think that there are really interesting ways in which this, say, Australian research could be taken forward. Arguably, you could do I'm looking at Murray, I can see you on my screen. I'm sort of thinking if you were approaching this study as a social scientist, you would possibly be less interested in particular letters, for instance. You would probably look for ways to compile data and look for more trends or patterns in a sort of a more perhaps qualitative sense, for instance. And I'm thinking that with rise, I think we're sort of a bit past the rise, with digital humanities, there might be different ways to sort of create data sets and mine data around Australian audiences. I should also acknowledge at this point that there is, of course, another absolutely fundamental dimension to audience research, which is the qualitative research that's done by the industry itself. So, there was the audience research department at the ABC. There were formal ratings agencies that did obviously research listening and viewing patterns. So that's something that I've touched on in this book, but actually not dealt with that much, because as I went on, I just found so much material that I decided that I would sort of zoom in more on the, sorry, I think I was saying before, my brain is so fried by the technical challenges this afternoon. I was saying qualitative, whereas I meant quantitative. Okay. Apologies. Thank you, Murray. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I decided to look at different things, but I think that there would also be the potential to sort of mine the memories of Australian media consumers more. I know that, I'm not sure if Virginia Madsen is here now, but I think she was part of a radio production that was done several years ago, which actually did draw on the memories of some listeners to talk radio on the ABC. There have been attempts to set up, hi Virginia, there have been attempts to set up websites where people can feed in memories of their television viewing. So I guess I'm sort of thinking aloud here about the sorts of possibilities where you could take some of this, you know, some of the kind of challenges of the archive forward.
Yes, if I can butt in, you do mention the ABC and the BBC listener research, but just in passing, it would be fascinating. There's a separate project comparing the two, but I'm just wondering with the ABC did some qualitative research that you know that you could use against some of your incredibly rich material from the ABC.
Thanks, Murray. Look, that's a really good question. They absolutely did. And a number of those surveys have been preserved by the National Archives. So these would be, you know, there could be research, there were studies undertaken of particular networks, of listening or viewing particular programs, or of particular regions of Australia. And the project, the last substantive chapter in the book is about television viewers committees, which were set up by the ABC in the late 1950s. They went to 1965. They were in each capital city of Australia, except for Brisbane, which is another story. They never got around to it, and then they were disbanded. But I'm actually this semester doing some work on the different advisory committees that were present at the ABC. So by the 1960s, there were something like 56 different advisory committees. So these were based on partly on regions. So there was one for each capital city. There were a few other regional ones. There were there were advisory committees that related to programming specialties, so religion, science, women. Most of these committees have been almost entirely overlooked by historians, including Ken Inglis in his wonderful 2 books on the history of the ABC. I've now looked at the television ones to some extent. There's been a little bit of interest by Kylie, Janine and others on the women's advisory committees. I know that Janine's done a little bit of work on Western Australia, but I'm going to sort of use these this semester as a way into looking at how the ABC was seeking to draw on expertise, but also gauge the kind of interests of different sort of constituent bodies of listeners and viewers.
We probably have time for one more question, I'd say. So if there's any, I'd like to ask a final question. Matt, were you going to ask a question?
I've got a very broad question, and that's how's the relationship between audiences and television and radio companies and or personalities changed across the 20th century?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, look, that is a big question. Look, I think one of the early journal articles that I wrote, I think it was in the late 1990s now, was at the time that reality television was, you know, being treated as this kind of extraordinarily popular international phenomenon. That, you know, comes to Australia just as a, you know, whether it comes out of the United States or Holland or whatever. But I became interested at the time in looking at this sort of precedence to or to that. From some of the work that I'd done a little bit on the Bulletin in the late 19th century, some work that I'd done on the Women's Weekly in the 1930s, I was kind of really interested in this element of kind of interactivity, of this really overt attempt to engage audiences. So I would actually argue that, okay, obviously technologies have changed, and you know, the sizes of audiences have changed. Audiences have become much more fragmented. There's less sort of water cooler broadcasting moments than there used to be. But I think that there is quite a long arc of really sort of interactive audience engagement. And I'm really conscious of time and thinking, I always promise, I'm just putting my other hat on for a moment, Justine, I'm so sorry, but I really don't know who I am this afternoon after the chaos, but I always promise to get people out within the hour, and I know that we are at the 1 hour mark. So
yes.
Perhaps we should wind it up.
We've had lots of messages saying what a fantastic set of insights you've brought to it, and just your incredible professionalism today and coping with all the challenges, but also the way that you just are so clear, and the way you bring everything together, and this incredible research that you've done. So again, these are new rituals to me, but I'd like to propose a toast to Bridget